She said she just danced with them. That's what Lena told me when I asked why 4 guys were at our table, sitting in my seat, drinking with my wife, on our 10th anniversary. I was holding her drink, ready to toast the life we'd built together. Instead, I watched her laugh at their jokes, rub her hand along my thigh while whispering in one of their ears. That's when I knew. Something was broken, maybe beyond repair. You ever look back and realize the signs were always there? That the betrayal didn't start that night, it just finally showed itself? What Lena did at that party destroyed something in me. But what I uncovered afterward, that changed everything. I thought public humiliation was the worst thing I'd face. But then came the affair. The lies. The manipulation. And the secret that would blow everything wide open. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a story of truth, reckoning, and the rise that followed. Thank you for watching this far. If this story hit you somewhere deep, drop a 1 in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this channel with someone who needs to hear that loyalty isn't weakness, it's power when given to the right person. Brandon Parker had always believed in loyalty, the quiet, unshakable kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud. At 42, he wasn't flashy or dramatic. He was dependable, consistent, the kind of man who remembered birthdays, fixed leaky sinks without being asked, and still held the door open for his wife, Lena, even after 10 years of marriage. So when he booked the trip to Florida's Gulf Coast to celebrate their anniversary, it wasn't just a getaway, it was a chance to reconnect, to bring back something he felt had been slipping between them. They had met in their late 20s, when Brandon was managing structural projects in Dallas and Lena was teaching art at a local high school. She was vibrant, full of life, and he was the steady ground she could build on. At least, that's how it used to be. Somewhere between promotions and routines, late-night screen time and missed conversations, things had shifted, but Brandon still held on to the idea that love could be repaired if you just tried hard enough. The first night in Florida, he noticed Lena had packed differently. Gone were the cozy, casual dresses she used to wear on beach vacations. Instead, her suitcase was filled with tight tops, revealing swimsuits, and heels she had never bothered to bring before. She took longer in the bathroom, wore makeup to breakfast, and seemed glued to her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. At first, he chalked it up to her wanting to feel attractive. Who was he to judge? But something in her smile didn't reach her eyes anymore. When he'd lean over to show her a funny video, she'd fake a chuckle and look away. She wasn't cold, just distant. Like her body was there, but the part of her that once lit up when he walked into a room, that part was somewhere else entirely. The resort lounge was buzzing that night with warm laughter, clinking glasses, and the easy rhythm of a live jazz band drifting through the open windows. Candles flickered on each table, casting soft glows on the faces of couples dancing, talking, and losing themselves in the illusion of paradise. Brandon had chosen the place specifically. It was small, intimate, the kind of spot where you could hold hands across a table and remember why you fell in love in the first place. Lena looked stunning in a silky crimson dress that hugged her figure, her hair curled in loose waves that framed her face like something out of a movie. When they first arrived, she smiled at him, even leaned in to kiss his cheek, but the moment they sat down, her eyes started scanning the room. It wasn't long before a group of younger guys, mid-20s, maybe, walked in loud and confident, clearly on a boys' trip judging by the matching polos and the way they high-fived each other at the bar. Brandon didn't think anything of it at first. Until he saw one of them glance at Lena a little too long. She didn't look away. She smiled. Brandon excused himself to grab their drinks, thinking nothing of it. It was their anniversary. After all, maybe she was just feeling good, a little flirty, a little bold. He waited at the bar, watching the bartenders stir their signature sunset margaritas, and when he turned to walk back, the world seemed to pause for half a beat. There, at their table, one of the guys from the group was now sitting in his chair. Not just any chair, the one Brandon had just vacated. The table had shifted, too, now pushed up against the groups, creating one big circle. Lena was at the center of it, laughing like she'd known them for years. As Brandon approached, one of the guys slapped another on the back and leaned in toward Lena, who tossed her head back in a way Brandon hadn't seen in months. He stood behind the guy in his seat, waiting. Neither Lena nor the guy looked up. After a few awkward seconds, Brandon cleared his throat and said, calmly but firmly, "That's my seat." The guy looked startled, shifted over with a laugh, but before Brandon could sit down, Lena slid his drink to the now empty seat next to her and said, "Sit there, it's better anyway." Brandon sat, unsure of what was happening or why he felt like a stranger in his own marriage. Lena placed a hand on his thigh, leaned close like she might whisper something intimate, but instead turned her head away and started talking to the same guy again, still touching Brandon absently like he was a prop. She giggled, playfully nudged the guy, and when Brandon tried to interject, she waved him off with a smile. "Relax, babe," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "They're just being friendly. It's not that deep." The guys laughed. Brandon didn't. He sat there, watching his wife flirt shamelessly with men they had met less than an hour ago, and every second felt like he was disappearing, like the version of him that believed in them was dissolving right there under the low lights and Lena's carefully applied lipstick. Brandon leaned in, lowering his voice so the table wouldn't hear, trying to salvage some dignity while holding on to the hope that maybe Lena would come to her senses. "Lena," he said gently, "can we just have this night to ourselves? It's our anniversary. I didn't come here to watch you entertain four guys we don't even know." She barely looked at him, her lips forming a tight, amused smile. "Brandon," she whispered back, tone dripping with condescension, "you're overthinking everything. I'm just having fun. It's not like I'm sleeping with them." The way she said it, like it was such a ridiculous thought, like he was the one being unreasonable, made Brandon's chest tighten. He glanced at the guys, who were now pretending not to listen but clearly enjoying the drama. One even smirked as he swirled his drink. "This is crossing a line," Brandon said, more firmly now. "Can we go?" Lena's eyes flicked toward him, then back to her drink. She took a long sip, then leaned toward the guy next to her and said, loud enough for Brandon to hear, "You'd think after 10 years, he'd loosen up a little." The guy laughed, and something broke inside Brandon right then, a thread that had been holding his restraint together finally snapped. She turned back toward him, almost casually, and added with a playful smirk, "Maybe if you were more fun, I wouldn't need someone else to get a drink with." The words were sharp, precise, and intentionally humiliating. The laughter at the table spread like a wildfire, and Brandon could feel his face burning. She didn't even flinch, didn't look sorry. In fact, she looked energized, like she was feeding off the reaction, the spectacle. "You're embarrassing me," he said quietly, but even that felt pointless now. Lena shrugged, brushing imaginary dust off her shoulder, then tossed her hair like she was on stage. "You embarrassed yourself," she said flatly, reaching across the table to clink glasses with the guy who had taken her last dance. "Just because you're boring doesn't mean I have to be." Brandon sat there, stunned for a moment, watching the woman he thought he knew perform in front of strangers like he was the outsider, like he was the problem. His stomach twisted in a way that no amount of anger could fix, not anymore. This wasn't a one-time slip or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Public. Cruel. He stood slowly, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and for a second, the table fell quiet. Lena didn't even glance at him. She was too busy laughing at something one of the guys had whispered. Brandon looked down at his wife, not saying another word, just taking her in, the image of her, the new version he didn't recognize, and then walked away. Past the dancing couples. Past the bar. Out into the night where the music faded behind him and the salty air off the ocean met his face like a slap. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He didn't go back. He just walked, step after step, carrying the weight of knowing that something sacred had been shattered in plain sight. And the worst part wasn't even the betrayal, it was realizing she didn't care that she'd done it in front of everyone. Brandon returned to their hotel room alone, the silence inside pressing against his ears like static. He sat on the edge of the bed, still dressed, the drink he never got to finish sitting untouched on the nightstand. He glanced at the clock, 10:47 p.m. The lounge would be closing soon. He figured maybe Lena would come stumbling in, still laughing, still tipsy, still oblivious. Maybe she'd give a half-hearted apology or spin it into a joke, expecting him to brush it off like she always did. He checked his phone, nothing. No call, no message. He stared at the screen, hoping it would light up. It didn't. So he waited, eyes fixed on the door like a soldier watching the horizon, every second that passed feeling heavier than the last. He tried to distract himself, turned on the TV, flipped through channels, but every laugh track, every upbeat commercial, felt like an insult. When the clock hit midnight, he stood, went to the balcony, and stared down at the winding paths that led back to the lounge. Still nothing. Just darkness, faint music in the distance, and the heavy knowledge that his wife had chosen strangers over him on their anniversary. He finally walked back downstairs, not really knowing what he was looking for. Maybe just closure. Maybe just proof that his instincts hadn't betrayed him. He passed the front desk and made his way to the lounge, now dim with cleanup underway. Chairs stacked, floors swept, lights brighter and unforgiving. A lone bartender was wiping down the bar. Brandon approached him, slow and unsure. "Hey," he said, voice low. "Did you see my wife? She was here earlier with 4 guys. Dark red dress. Brown hair." The bartender paused, looked at him for a long second, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, she was here. Left about an hour ago," he said. Brandon's chest tightened. "Alone?" he asked, though he already knew. The bartender hesitated. "No. 2 of the guys walked out with her. One of them bought 2 bottles of wine to go. Charged to room service." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "You remember the room number?" The guy hesitated again, then leaned in with a quiet voice. "You didn't hear it from me. But it was 408. They left together." Brandon nodded, pulled a few bills from his wallet, and dropped them on the bar without another word. As he walked toward the elevator, something inside him twisted, not rage, not quite heartbreak, just a hollow kind of knowing, the kind that made you feel older in minutes. He stood in front of the door to 408, pulse thudding in his ears. He almost knocked. Almost turned around. But instead, he tried the knob. Unlocked. As the door creaked open, the scene inside stopped him cold. The room smelled like wine and perfume. Soft music played from a phone docked in the corner. And there, on the couch, was Lena. Fully clothed, legs tucked under her, lips locked with one of the guys from the lounge, her hand resting on his chest like it belonged there. Another man, shirtless, stood near the kitchenette, pouring wine like they were old friends in someone's apartment. For a moment, none of them noticed Brandon. And in that moment, he saw everything he needed. The laughter, the comfort, the intimacy that wasn't his. When Lena finally looked up, her expression didn't register shame or panic, just surprise, like she'd forgotten about him altogether. Brandon didn't speak. He didn't yell. He just backed out, shut the door quietly, and walked away down the hall, the sounds of their laughter echoing like a ghost behind him. He didn't slam the door. He didn't curse or shout or demand an explanation. He just walked, step by steady step, down the hallway and into the elevator, breathing as if each breath were borrowed. His hands were fists in his pockets, not from anger but to keep them from shaking. In that moment, Brandon realized there was nothing left to say. What could he possibly ask her that wouldn't already sound pathetic? "Are you sorry? Do you even care? Why him, why them, why tonight?" No answer would make sense, no apology would matter. The sound of her laughter, the ease of her touch on another man, it was burned into his mind now, a living scar. And more than the betrayal, more than the cheating, it was the fact that she didn't even try to hide it. That was the part that shattered something inside him that he wasn't sure could be pieced back together. He walked the beach for over an hour, the moon cutting silver across the water, waves lapping softly like they didn't care who had just lost everything. His shoes sank into the sand as he moved without direction, the salt air doing nothing to clear the fog in his head. He wasn't crying. He wasn't even angry anymore. Just empty. Numb, like someone had flipped a switch inside him and dimmed all the lights. He thought about the way she used to look at him, really look, and realized it had been months, maybe years, since that gaze had meant anything. He thought about the anniversaries past, the promises, the small traditions. He thought about how quickly all of it had been traded for a few hours of attention from strangers. And then, without warning, his heart stopped aching. It simply hardened. Not out of spite. Out of survival. She came back to the room just after 9, sunlight pouring through the sheer curtains like nothing had happened. Brandon was already dressed, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. Lena walked in humming, hair still slightly damp from a morning shower, just not one she'd taken in their room. She didn't look surprised to see him, didn't look ashamed. In fact, she smiled. "Hey, babe," she said lightly, as if the night before hadn't happened at all. "You left kind of early. I figured you just needed space." She dropped her purse on the table, kicked off her sandals, and moved to the mirror to fix her makeup. "I hope you're not mad. You know how I get when there's music and good energy." She looked over her shoulder, expecting a laugh or at least a response. Brandon said nothing. He just watched her. Not with hatred. Just a final, distant kind of clarity. He stood slowly, walked across the room, and opened the safe where he'd stashed a thick manila envelope before they left for the trip. He'd had it prepared weeks earlier, more out of fear than certainty, but something inside him must have known. Lena turned as he laid the envelope on the table between them. "What's this?" she asked, the first flicker of tension cracking her voice. Brandon didn't answer. He simply walked past her, picked up his keys, and paused at the door. "They're already signed," he said without looking back. "Send them to your lawyer, or don't. Doesn't matter anymore." Lena stared at the envelope like it might explode. "You're serious?" she asked, stepping forward. He finally turned to her, eyes steady. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." And then he walked out, leaving her in the silence she deserved. The silence afterward was a different kind of loud. Brandon didn't go home right away. He stayed in a small motel an hour inland, far from the glittering beaches and artificial smiles. He didn't talk to anyone. Didn't answer texts. He just sat in the quiet, letting the weight of it all settle in like dust on furniture left untouched. The lies didn't scream at him, they whispered, over and over, playing back scenes that suddenly made sense in the worst possible way. The late nights at work, the sudden urge to get in shape, the way she started guarding her phone like it held state secrets. It wasn't the cheating that broke him, it was the knowledge that she had been fading for a long time while he kept trying to pour life back into something already cold. And the worst part? She never once gave him the truth. He had to see it for himself. He started retracing every moment of their relationship, from the night they met to the second she slid his drink across the table to another seat. How much of it had been real? Had she ever truly loved him, or was he just convenient? A safe place to land until someone more exciting came along? The wedding vows, the inside jokes, the quiet Sunday mornings reading in bed, they used to feel sacred. Now they felt scripted. Like he'd been following a storyline she'd grown bored of and rewritten behind his back. He couldn't stop wondering what else she'd hidden, what other parts of their life she'd edited without him noticing. He'd always believed marriage was built on trust, but now he realized trust could be weaponized, too. Used to keep someone blind long enough to walk right off a cliff. And that's exactly what he'd done, hand in hand with the person who pushed him. It didn't take long for Lena to rewrite the narrative. By the time Brandon returned home, word had already spread. According to her, he had snapped on vacation. She told her brothers that he was emotionally distant, cold, and, her favorite word, controlling. She left out the lounge, the drinks, the strangers. Instead, she painted herself as the neglected wife who had tried to spice things up while Brandon allegedly sat on his bitterness like a throne. To anyone who would listen, she was the victim of a husband too uptight to handle a woman with a little spirit. Her voice trembled just enough when she told the story, and she knew exactly when to look away and dab at the corner of her eye. It worked. Her brothers, Ethan and Kyle, called Brandon 2 days later with thinly veiled anger in their voices, acting like they were stepping in to rescue their sister from a monster she hadn't even tried to understand. They invited him to a local bar under the pretense of having a civil conversation, but the moment he walked in, Brandon could feel the tension radiating from their booth like heat off a burner. Ethan leaned forward immediately. "Man, what the hell happened in Florida?" he demanded. Lena came back crying her eyes out. "She said you went off the rails, ditched her on your anniversary, and now you're serving her divorce papers like she cheated on you or something." Kyle crossed his arms and added, "She told us you've been controlling for years. That you make her feel small, like she can't breathe." Brandon didn't respond right away. He just sat down, folded his hands on the table, and looked at both of them. He could have gotten angry, could have defended himself with emotion. But instead, he let the silence work for him. Then he pulled out his phone, scrolled for a moment, and placed it face up on the table. "Before you believe everything she said," he said quietly, "watch this." It was a short video clip, captured by a hallway camera at the resort. The timestamp read 12:47 a.m. It showed Lena leaving the lounge with two men. Brandon didn't say a word while they watched. He didn't need to. The truth spoke louder than her performance ever could. Brandon didn't stop at the video. Once it ended, he pulled up another file, screenshots of messages from Nick, one of the guys Lena had left the lounge with. Nick had reached out to Brandon 2 days after the trip, full of apologies and nervous energy. His texts were laced with guilt, as if he'd only just realized the woman he had been fooling around with was married. In the messages, Lena had not only downplayed her marriage, she had painted Brandon as emotionally abusive and claimed they were basically separated. She even asked to meet up again, saying she missed how alive she felt around Nick. Brandon scrolled slowly, letting each screenshot linger long enough for Ethan and Kyle to read every word. The part that hit hardest was when Nick admitted he didn't even know Lena was married until Brandon walked into the suite. "I wouldn't have touched her if I knew," he wrote. "She told me you were out of the picture." Brandon replayed the hallway video next, though they'd already seen it. This time, he let it run longer, up to the moment Lena left with the two men and disappeared down the corridor. He didn't explain. He didn't fill the silence. It was the kind of silence that told a deeper story, the kind of stillness that only happens when someone's world starts to tilt sideways. When it ended, he locked his phone and placed it back in his pocket. "You were saying?" he asked, his voice level. Neither of them answered right away. Ethan stared down at the table, lips pressed tight, jaw working like he was chewing on the bitterness of his mistake. Kyle leaned back, dragging his hand down his face, eyes still on the door like he wanted to walk through it and disappear. They weren't just embarrassed, they were stunned. The image they had of their sister had cracked, and through the fractures, the truth was impossible to ignore. After a long pause, Ethan finally looked up. "She didn't tell us any of this," he said, the heat in his voice replaced with a quiet sort of shame. Kyle nodded slowly. "She made it sound like you just walked away for no reason. Like she tried to save the marriage and you shut her down." Brandon shrugged, not bitter, not smug. Just tired. "That's her story. I figured it wouldn't be long before she started rewriting everything. I didn't bring this to ruin your relationship with her, I just wanted you to stop looking at me like I'm the villain." The weight of truth settled on the table between them. No more shouting. No more defense. Just the hollow ring of reality, echoing in the silence they'd once filled with judgment. For the first time since the divorce papers were served, Brandon didn't feel like he had to prove anything. Because finally, the truth had done it for him. The drive home after meeting Lena's brothers was quiet, but Brandon's thoughts were anything but. For the first time in weeks, the anger had settled, leaving behind a raw, unsettling stillness. It was a relief. It was recognition of how deeply he'd been manipulated. Lena hadn't just cheated on him, she'd rewritten the story of their marriage and cast herself as the victim. And the worst part? For a while, he had almost believed her. The isolation hadn't started in Florida. It had begun long before, slowly, methodically, missed phone calls, emotional withdrawal, the way she started looking at him like a stranger rather than a partner. She gaslighted him with a smile, made him question his tone, his reactions, even his sanity. She'd twist arguments until he found himself apologizing for things he hadn't done. He used to think they were just going through a rough patch, that all marriages had cold seasons. But now he saw it clearly, she wasn't just drifting, she was steering away, already facing another shore. Later that night, he stood alone in the garage, staring at the old camping gear they hadn't used in years. Dusty memories. Forgotten promises. His fingers grazed the handle of a worn backpack, and suddenly he was 29 again, watching Lena dance barefoot under string lights during their first trip to Lake Tahoe. They'd made s'mores by the fire, and she had climbed into his lap, hair tangled, laughter in her voice, saying, "Let's never lose this." He remembered thinking he'd never loved anyone more. She used to bring him coffee while he worked late. She'd leave notes in his lunchbox. They'd make playlists for road trips, racing to name songs before the chorus hit. That version of Lena had felt real, effortless, like home. So when had it changed? When did the spark go from flickering to dead? He couldn't pinpoint the day. That's the thing about slow fades, they don't announce themselves. They disguise decay as routine, until one day you wake up and realize the person lying next to you has already left, emotionally packed up and gone long before the suitcase ever did. Brandon leaned back against the cold wall, eyes closed, chest tight with memory and loss. He wasn't just mourning the woman who betrayed him, he was grieving the woman she used to be, and the man he had been when he believed she still existed. The days that followed were a blur of going through the motions, work, emails, empty dinners in a quiet house, but beneath it all, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more he hadn't uncovered. Something deeper, something Lena hadn't let slip. The betrayal at the resort had been blatant, but what if it wasn't the beginning? What if it was just the part that finally boiled over? That thought settled in his chest like wet cement, heavy and immovable. So he did something he never imagined he'd do. He picked up the phone and called a private investigator. The man came highly recommended, discreet, efficient, not cheap. His name was Rick Dalton, an ex-cop with a calm voice and the kind of steady presence that made you feel like you weren't crazy for asking questions that tore your life in half. They met in a coffee shop on the edge of town. Brandon laid it all out, no filters, no sugarcoating, just the truth, raw and bitter. "I'm not looking for revenge," he told him. "I just want the full picture. I can't move on if I don't know what I was living through." Rick nodded, jotting notes in a plain leather-bound notebook, the kind that felt more like a ledger of secrets than anything else. After the meeting, Brandon thought he'd feel lighter, but instead, he felt exposed. Vulnerable. Like asking for the truth had opened a door he wasn't sure he wanted to walk through. Rick had said it might take a couple of weeks, discretion took time. So Brandon waited. Each day felt like a ticking clock, not knowing what was coming but knowing something was. Every time his phone buzzed, his stomach tightened. Every unknown number felt like it might be the call. At night, he lay awake, replaying every moment with Lena like a courtroom reel, every excuse, every canceled dinner, every time she had turned her phone face down when a text came through. He'd once chalked it up to overthinking, not wanting to be that guy, the suspicious husband. But now he wondered if his instincts had been trying to scream through the noise all along. The silence from the PI made the space in his head louder. What if she had been cheating long before Florida? What if that resort wasn't a one-time betrayal but just the first one he saw? He wasn't sure what would be worse, learning it was recent, or realizing it had been going on while he still believed in forever. Either way, the answers were coming. And Brandon knew, deep down, that whatever Rick found, it was going to hurt. Because the truth always does. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, just as Brandon was about to step into a meeting. Rick's voice was calm as ever, but there was a weight behind his words that immediately put Brandon on edge. "I've got something," he said. "You might want to sit down when you look at this." 10 minutes later, Brandon sat alone in his car, engine off, phone in hand, staring at the email that had just come through. Inside was a file, photos, timestamps, a short report. The first image showed Lena in a parking garage, smiling, leaning in close to a man with his hand on her lower back. Another showed them entering a hotel lobby together around lunchtime. The report noted this had happened 3 times over the last month. Each time, same hotel, same man. She wasn't just sneaking around with strangers on vacation, this was local, routine, planned. A pattern. She had a whole second life and had carefully compartmentalized it, like Brandon was just a character in the part she played at home. His fingers trembled as he zoomed in on one of the photos, trying to make sense of the man's face. He looked familiar, but the grain of the camera left it fuzzy. Brandon scrolled down to the name listed in Rick's report. At first, he didn't register it. Then it hit him like a punch to the chest. Aaron. Aaron Jennings. The name spun in his head like a cruel joke. He knew that name. Knew it because he'd helped Aaron move into his first house. Knew it because he'd sat next to him at countless family dinners. Knew it because Aaron was married to Brandon's younger sister, Emily. His sister. Brandon dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, staring out the windshield like it would anchor him. But the world had gone blurry. Breath shallow, heart pounding in his throat, he realized this wasn't just betrayal. This wasn't just cheating. This was something darker, something that rewrote the entire foundation of trust within his family. Lena hadn't just destroyed her vows. She'd torched the people closest to him and done it with a smile. The rage didn't come right away. First came disbelief. He kept thinking there had to be a mistake, that maybe Rick had gotten the wrong man. But the photos were clear enough now. The shape of Aaron's jaw, the watch he always wore, the stupid jacket with the elbow patches Brandon had joked about. It was him. His sister's husband. And suddenly, all the pieces locked into place like a cruel puzzle. Lena's sudden interest in networking events. The night she'd claimed to be helping a friend through a rough patch. The vague stories about coworkers Brandon never met. He thought he was unraveling one thread, but now he saw the whole tapestry, and it was rotten at the core. There was no fixing this. No talking through it. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated betrayal that had been happening right under his nose. And now, the fallout wouldn't just tear apart his marriage. It would rip through his family like shrapnel. The next morning, Brandon drove across town in a fog of adrenaline and disbelief, gripping the steering wheel like it might hold him together. He hadn't slept. His thoughts kept looping between the photos, the report, and the name. He didn't call ahead. He couldn't. This wasn't the kind of conversation you scheduled. When he pulled into Emily's driveway, his gut twisted at the sight of Aaron's car parked out front, right where it always was. He knocked hard enough to startle the dog inside. Emily opened the door, hair pulled into a messy bun, wearing Brandon's old college sweatshirt, one she'd borrowed a decade ago and never returned. Her face lit up at first, but when she saw his expression, it faded instantly. "What's wrong?" she asked, eyes narrowing. Brandon didn't say anything. He just pulled out his phone, opened the file, and handed it to her. "Tell me you didn't know," he said, barely above a whisper. Emily stared at the screen, her face draining of color as she scrolled. "Oh my God," she murmured, backing up a step. No, this can't be real." She collapsed onto the couch, hands shaking, and covered her mouth as the first tear slipped down her cheek. "I thought," she choked, voice breaking, "I thought I was crazy." Her shoulders began to shake as the dam broke, months of suspicion spilling out. "There were signs," she said through sobs. "Late meetings, cold kisses, stupid excuses. I even asked him once if there was someone else, and he made me feel insane for saying it. I told myself I was just being insecure." Her voice faded into a bitter laugh, sharp and hollow. Brandon sat beside her, not speaking, just listening. The betrayal had gone both ways, but the pain in her voice wasn't theatrical. It was raw. "Lena," she whispered, shaking her head. "Of all people, it was her. She played with my kids. She helped me decorate for Christmas. She held my hand when I was in labor with my second child." Her words crumbled into silence, and for a moment they sat together, two people gutted by the same wound, bleeding from different angles. It hit Brandon then, the full scale of what had been done. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a systemic collapse of trust, of relationships, of years built on what turned out to be lies. It wasn't just his marriage that had been violated, it was his sense of reality, his belief in the people he thought were safe. The depth of the betrayal reached places he didn't know were vulnerable. And what hurt more was the realization that both Lena and Aaron had moved through their lives like nothing was wrong. Smiling at family dinners. Holding their spouses' hands. Laughing during holidays. All while orchestrating an affair that cut through two homes like a blade. There was no making sense of it. No justification. No accident to hide behind. It was deliberate. Personal. Cold. And Brandon understood now that this wasn't just about heartbreak. It was about rebuilding after devastation. About finding footing in the rubble. And the first step was confronting it head-on, no more silence, no more pretending. It was time to bring it all into the light, no matter who had to face it. In the days that followed, Brandon moved with quiet purpose, like a man setting up a chessboard with every piece in place before the final move. He met with his attorney to review what would become the last round of divorce paperwork. He gathered the screenshots, the surveillance photos, and the message logs, every scrap of truth Lena had tried to bury. But this time, he wasn't planning a private confrontation. He'd spent too long being accused, pitted, and misunderstood. This time, he wanted the truth to have witnesses. So he made the calls. He invited Lena to the law office under the pretense of finalizing documents. He asked her parents to be present, telling them gently that it was important. He reached out to her boss as well, calmly, professionally, making it clear that what he had to share wasn't a personal attack, but something they needed to know. Every name on that list had once been part of the illusion. Now they would see what was real. The night before the meeting, Brandon sat in his living room alone, the only light coming from a single lamp in the corner. He didn't feel anger anymore. What remained was a steady, clear ache, less like a wound and more like a scar forming. He wasn't doing this to humiliate Lena, and it wasn't about punishing Aaron. This was about drawing a line. He needed to reclaim his narrative, to show the people around him that he hadn't been the villain in her story, or the fool who walked away for no reason. This wasn't vengeance, it was clarity. He breathed deeply, feeling the weight of what was coming, and welcomed it. Because the next day wasn't just about exposing lies. It was about freeing himself from them once and for all. Lena arrived at the law office in a fitted blazer and heels, makeup flawless, confidence dialed up just enough to give the impression of control. She thought this was her chance to shift the narrative, maybe soften Brandon with a few tears, play the misunderstood wife who made a mistake but still wanted to make things right. She had already crafted the speech in her head, about love, pressure, miscommunication, and how they could still save what they'd built. She believed that Brandon's silence over the last few weeks meant there was still a door open, still a chance he hadn't completely closed his heart. What she didn't know was that the meeting she was walking into wasn't just with him. It wasn't a quiet conversation behind closed doors. It was a reckoning, and the door behind her was about to shut in a way that would leave no room for pretending anymore. As she stepped into the conference room, her stride faltered for the first time. Her parents were seated near the end of the long table, their expressions unreadable but stiff with tension. On the opposite side sat her boss, Mr. Langford, looking grim and professionally distant. And beside him, her jaw clenched when she saw her, was Brandon's sister, Emily, arms crossed, eyes locked on her with a look that didn't contain rage, only something colder, disgust. Lena blinked, then turned to Brandon, who was seated at the head of the table, calm and composed, a folder resting neatly in front of him. For the first time in a long while, he looked like a man with nothing left to lose, and everything to reveal. The room was too quiet. The air too heavy. And suddenly, Lena realized this wasn't a chance to fix anything. This was her curtain call. Brandon didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice or perform some grand, dramatic gesture. He simply reached for his phone, unlocked it, and placed it on the table. Before we sign anything, he said quietly, there are a few things everyone here deserves to hear. He pressed play. The recording that followed was clear, unmistakable. Lena's voice filled the room, laughing, then softening into something flirtatious as she spoke to Nick, the man from the resort. Her words were unmistakable. It's not like I'm really married. Brandon and I are pretty much done. I just haven't told him yet. Another clip played, her admitting she had more fun in one night with someone new than in years with her husband. Her tone wasn't defensive or apologetic. It was light, casual, like she was describing a minor inconvenience. When the second recording ended, Lena's smile had vanished. Her shoulders pulled inward slightly, as if trying to shrink under the weight of her own voice echoing back at her. Without a word, Brandon opened the folder and spread its contents across the table, printed screenshots, dated and time-stamped. Lena's messages to Nick. The flirty texts, the hotel arrangements, the subtle jabs at Brandon. He pointed to one image, a surveillance still from the hotel parking lot. This was taken 2 days before our anniversary, he said. While I was planning a weekend to save our marriage, she was booking a room with someone else. Then he slid another set of photos across to her boss. These showed Lena in the same hotel lobby on 3 separate afternoons, each with the same man, Aaron. The timestamps were damning. Mid-work hours. The report from the PI included clear evidence that this wasn't a one-time lapse. It had been going on for months. Brandon passed around a simple printed timeline, dates, times, details that lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. No one spoke. No one needed to. The evidence had already spoken louder than any apology ever could. Then came the final blow. Brandon's voice was steady, measured. There's something else, he said, turning toward Lena, who now sat frozen, her face drained of color. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed Emily. He glanced at his sister, who didn't flinch. Because the man you've been sneaking around with, the one you met during lunch breaks, the one who bought you that necklace you thought I wouldn't notice, was her husband. The words dropped like a grenade in the middle of the table. Lena's head snapped toward Emily, whose expression hadn't changed. But the silence that followed was deafening. Lena opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted from Brandon to Emily, to her parents, to her boss. The walls were closing in now, and there was nowhere left to hide. I gave you the benefit of the doubt, Brandon continued, right up until the moment I found out the person you were tearing apart wasn't just me. It was my family. You lied. You gaslit. You destroyed trust like it was a toy you didn't care about anymore. He paused, then added with a grim finality, now you don't get to rewrite the story. Her parents sat stiffly, the shock hitting them in slow waves. Her mother looked like she wanted to speak, but her lips trembled too much to form words. Her father sat with his hands folded tightly, face pale, eyes locked on the folder in front of him like it held a version of his daughter he didn't know existed. Finally, her mother whispered, Lena, is this true? Lena didn't answer. She stared down at her lap, fingers gripping the edge of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mr. Langford, her boss, cleared his throat and straightened in his seat. Given what's been shown here today, he said, voice clipped and professional, and considering the violation of our workplace policies regarding extramarital relationships with a married colleague, I'll be placing you on immediate administrative leave pending formal review. Expect a call by end of day. Lena's face crumpled as she looked up, but he was already standing, gathering his things, his eyes never quite meeting hers. Brandon watched it all in silence. Not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a deep, settled calm. The truth was finally out, and it had arrived like a wrecking ball. Lena had spent months weaving lies and playing roles. But here, under the full weight of evidence, surrounded by people who once believed her, the performance ended. There was no more stage, no spotlight, no applause. Just the raw, irreversible truth. And while it hadn't brought him joy to watch her fall, it brought something far better, closure. As Mr. Langford exited the room and the heavy door clicked shut behind him, Lena finally broke. Her composure shattered like glass under pressure. She stood suddenly, eyes wide and glossy, voice trembling as she reached across the table toward Brandon. "Please," she whispered, then louder, "Brandon, don't do this. We can fix it. We can talk, just you and me, forget everyone else. I made a mistake, I know that now. I wasn't thinking clearly, I felt alone, I felt unwanted." Her voice cracked and she stumbled over her next words, mascara smudging as tears streamed down her face. "It wasn't love. It wasn't serious. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Please, don't throw away everything we had." She stepped around the table, as if she could close the gap with proximity, as if reaching him would undo the weight of her betrayal. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I was stupid. But I never stopped loving you." Brandon stood slowly, calm in the storm of her unraveling, his expression unreadable. He didn't step back. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her, really looked, and what she saw in his eyes was something she hadn't expected, not rage, not pain, but finality. "You keep saying I'm throwing it away," he said, voice quiet but firm. "But Lena, you gave it all away. Piece by piece. Lie by lie." His tone wasn't cruel, it was honest. "You didn't just cheat. You erased everything we built and handed it over like it meant nothing. And now, you want forgiveness because the walls finally caved in." He looked around the room, at her devastated parents, at Emily's cold silence, then back to Lena. "This isn't something to fix. It's something to walk away from." And without another word, he turned, walked to the door, and left her standing in the wreckage she created. 6 months had passed, and with them came a quiet kind of rebirth. Brandon now lived in Denver, in a modest but modern condo nestled just outside the city, where the mountains painted the horizon and the air carried a chill that reminded him he was somewhere new, somewhere his past couldn't follow. The ocean was gone, but so was the weight that had sat on his chest for years. His mornings were slower, more intentional. He'd wake early, brew coffee in silence, and step onto his small balcony to watch the city come alive beneath the early light. He no longer measured time in arguments or tension. He no longer braced himself for the next lie. In Denver, there was peace, and not the kind you pretend to have. The real kind. The kind that grows in the cracks where pain used to live and whispers, "You made it out." Julia had been unexpected. They met through mutual friends just weeks after he moved, introduced at a small dinner gathering where, for once, he didn't feel the need to explain himself. She didn't ask for a polished version of who he was, and he didn't feel the pressure to give one. Julia was grounded, emotionally intelligent, and spoke with the kind of honesty that made you trust her without trying. Their connection wasn't instant fireworks, it was quiet understanding. They talked about values instead of surface-level likes. She asked about his healing instead of his history. There was no jealousy, no games, no keeping score. Just presence. They didn't rush. They didn't have to. And somehow, in the steadiness of it all, Brandon felt something he hadn't in years, safe. Not just with her, but with himself. He no longer needed to prove anything. He was simply allowed to be. Work had flourished too. A few months after relocating, Brandon was offered a lead project management role at a top engineering firm downtown. The pay was better, but more importantly, so was the atmosphere. His ideas were heard. His work was respected. He no longer dragged emotional exhaustion into the office, and the shift was noticeable. His team saw the difference, and so did he. Confidence wasn't something he had to force anymore, it returned naturally, like a part of him that had only been waiting for the weight to lift. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't surviving. He was building something again, only this time, it was for himself. And it was solid, unshakable, and real. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the Denver skyline and warm light spilled across Brandon's living room, his phone buzzed with a number he hadn't blocked but hadn't touched in months. The message preview was short. Simple. "I miss us. Please forgive me." No name. No context. But he didn't need it. He stared at the screen for a long moment, not out of temptation or sadness, but out of recognition. It was the same voice that had once spun lies, built excuses, cried when cornered. A voice that used to unnerve him, rattle him, make him question himself. Now, it was just noise. An echo from a version of life that no longer existed. Without hesitation, he opened the message, read it once, then tapped delete. No reply. No reaction. Just silence. The chapter had closed long ago, and nothing she could say would ever rewrite the story he had already finished for himself. Sitting alone on his balcony that night, Brandon let the cool breeze wash over him, eyes following the flicker of distant city lights. The pain hadn't vanished overnight. Healing had been slow, messy, non-linear. There were nights he'd replay old conversations, wonder what signs he'd missed, or whether he'd held on too long. But slowly, those memories faded into lessons, sharp at first, but then softer, clearer. He'd learned that forgiveness wasn't about letting someone back in. Sometimes, it was about letting the anger go so it didn't follow you forever. He didn't hate Lena. He didn't wish her harm. He just no longer wished for her at all. And that was freedom. Peace didn't come with slamming doors or dramatic exits. It came with clarity. With choosing yourself, quietly and without apology. Lena had burned everything down thinking he'd be trapped in the ashes. But instead, he built something stronger from the ruins. Something honest. Something real. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about proving them wrong or making them regret it. Sometimes the best revenge is peace. The kind that fills your lungs without effort, that wraps around you like the evening wind, whispering, "You're finally free." If someone betrays you and shows no remorse, if they lie without blinking, rewrite history to protect themselves, and only reach out when everything falls apart, do they truly deserve a second chance? That's the question Brandon had to face, and maybe it's a question you face too. What do you believe? Can trust ever be rebuilt without accountability? Or is there a line that, once crossed, can't be returned from? I want to hear your thoughts. Let's make this more than just a story, let's make it a conversation. Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every one of them, and you never know who might find comfort or clarity in your words. Because chances are, someone else has walked a path just like yours, and your voice might be the one that helps them take their next step forward. Not all betrayals come with warning signs. Some slip in quietly, dressed as routine, disguised as distance. And by the time you recognize what's happening, something sacred has already been broken. But even when trust is shattered, even when love turns into a lie, that doesn't have to be the end of your story. Brandon's journey wasn't about revenge, it was about release. He didn't rise by tearing someone else down. He rose by choosing not to stay buried. That's the power you hold too. You don't need their apology to heal. You don't need them to admit what they did or see your worth. You already know who you are, even if they never did. The people who try to break you aren't always villains. Sometimes they're just broken themselves. But their damage doesn't have to become your legacy. What matters is what you do next. So if you're standing in the aftermath of betrayal, remember this: you don't need closure from them. You need courage from within. Choose peace. Choose growth. And most of all, choose yourself. Every single time.